So with that being said, I want to set the stage super quick. So I have a technical background. I think, a lot of people here may. And what really inspired me about technology was that it was so capable. You could do so much, but there are responsibilities involved with that, right? And as I've been an entrepreneur and been able to be translating these ideas into reality, right? And it's one of the best parts of building something is seeing other people interacting with it. So there's a lot of responsibility that takes. And so that's why I think this conversation is going to be fascinating, because Catalina is brilliant, Professor Catalina Toma. And also she's got some really cool things that she's been researching and that she's here to tell us about. So that being said, Catalina, thank you so much for being here. I will pass the torch off to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Benny, for the introduction. It's truly a delight to be here with you. I was telling Benny yesterday that I haven't given a lecture in about a year, so I'm super excited to do this with you today. I am a professor in the Department of Communication Arts. It's a bit of a misnomer because I'm a social scientist. I consider myself to be a media psychologist, so I study how people interact with the media and kind of the effects that emerge at the intersection between human psychology and communication technologies. The majority of my research is focused on relational communication. So I'm interested in how people relate to one another and how they make sense of one another when they're interacting in technological spaces. I've done a lot of work on self-presentation, so kind of the images of self that people construct in various online platforms, on deception, how much people lie, why people lie online, how technology can facilitate or inhibit deception, impression formation, which we'll talk about today, what kind of impressions we derive of other people. And lastly, lately, I should say, my research has been really focused on psychological well-being and online communication. So I'm interested in two fundamental questions, which is how various activities that we undertake on online platforms connect with well-being outcomes like self-esteem and social capital, or even depression and loneliness and those types of things. But also the reverse question, which is how individuals with various well-being vulnerabilities, so individuals with social anxiety or depression or loneliness, may utilize these technologies in ways that could be helpful or harmful. So that's the overview of my research. I've been talking to Benny and with Ben, our organizers, to try to think of topics that would be interesting to you in this space and in this forum. And we've decided to cover a little bit about impression formation, so how people draw impressions of others, especially strangers, in online platforms, and also some of the well-being literature that I do a lot of research on, in the hopes of providing you with maybe design ideas of how to design in ways that support well-being, and kind of understanding what kind of activities are detrimental or positive for well-being. But also, because of my background as a professor and as a theoretician, I kind of want to arm you with some theoretical perspectives that can help you understand the dynamics of what happens in online communication spaces. I always like to tell my students that there's nothing quite so practical as a good theory, because once you have those useful concepts have been validated by the data, you can apply them in your spaces and in the spaces that you care about and that you work on. So I'll give you some theoretical perspectives on how to think about some of these dynamics. With this being said, I welcome questions and perspectives and thoughts and insights at any point during my talk. I love that we're a small group and we get to chat with each other, so please don't feel like you're interrupting. I actually love interjections from the audience. Feel free to type your comment and Benny will read it to me. And with this being said, let me share my screen so you can see the PowerPoint that I have prepared. There we go. All right, so by way of introduction, just let me give you a broad framing. probably will be obvious to many of you, but this is the kind of thinking that is important to lay the foundation for as we move through the talk. So from a theoretical perspective, when I think, and the research community thinks about the effects of technology, we take a social shaping perspective. And the social shaping perspective is a simple but powerful idea that's important, especially in a historical context. So we view technological effects as stemming from two main sources. The first source is technological features of affordances. That's the kind of stuff that you'll probably design and think about, and that constantly fluctuate and change and evolve. So it presents a difficulty of maybe feeling like we're studying a moving target here. So we want to think a little strategically about which of the features and affordances that we work with are the most important and the most likely to endure and the most meaningful in generating effects. So that is one source that we're paying a lot of attention to. The other source is looking at user characteristics. It just really matters who the people are, what they're doing online, kind of what they bring to the table, because they're not a tabula rasa. And oftentimes when I talk to the media or to my students or with people in the community, there's an overemphasis on technological features and affordances as the main source of effects. I mean, technology will make you do various things and will have kind of these uniform and universal effects. And that's actually not at all the case. The effects of technologies are very much modulated by who the users are and what exactly they do online. So paying attention to that is really important, and understanding that effects are not universal. They vary quite a bit. There's a lot of variability. What's good for some people might not be so good for a different group of people, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to technological features and affordances, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, and they're constantly evolving and constantly changing. So what should we be paying attention to and thinking about? Here's what the literature suggests. One very meaningful cue in feature, I should say, in communication processes is the reduction in available cues. And here we're talking about nonverbal cues. When we interact with others in text-based spaces like email and texting is by far the most prevalent means of communication, especially amongst young people these days. It's important to understand that we just do not have the wealth of information that we have face-to-face. So, face-to-face we'll have access to people's appearance cues, nonverbal cues, body language, gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, so on and so forth. The nonverbal realm is actually really important in forming impressions. We derive a lot of our impressions based on that. And in many technological spaces, these are reduced or sometimes completely eliminated. That's why we talk about completely text-based spaces. Of course, Zoom and video conferencing recently has kind of shifted those dynamics. So we're reintroducing a lot of cues in our conversations and our interactions and trying to approximate what is happening in face-to-face spaces, because for the past year and a half, many of us have not been able to meet anybody face-to-face. But once we go back to normal, many of our interactions actually will take place in reduced cue environments, which are important to consider because they have a lot of psychological repercussions. Then it's not just that there's less cues, but the types of cues that we utilize online actually matters a great deal. Are they photographic? Are they purely textual? Are they videos? People connect with those in different ways, especially, as I said, with text-based cues, because those come with further affordances. For example, editability. Editability is something that is a luxury of text-based communication. We can revise and polish and reframe messages before we send them, sometimes even after we send them. And we don't realize how meaningful editability is until we don't have it. Like right now, if I say something undesirable, make some sort of a gaffe, I can take it back because the space that we're in right now is not editable for me. Editability goes hand in hand with synchronicity. So many spaces allow for real-time interaction and others do not. The ones that are asynchronous provide usually unlimited message composition time, so we can take as long as we want to think about and polish and revise the messages that we want to construct. And those are meaningful features that a lot of research shows that shift psychological dynamics. Reduced cues, editability, and asynchronicity are typically referred to as controllable affordances. They're the affordances that give us more control over communication, and that control can matter a great deal in various situations, right? Maybe, and for various people who are anxious, people who are stressed out, they might really want that control. That might be meaningful in situations where we're highly motivated to make positive impressions rather than in everyday communication with close partners. The audience is actually also really meaningful and really exciting for me, because if we think about social media spaces, for example, at no other point in history did the average person have command of such large audiences as we do nowadays through social media. At the click of a button, very little effort, we can get hundreds, thousands of eyes on our messages. And that's really cool in terms of the kinds of things what we can do, but it also can present a lot of pressure if we feel like we're being evaluated in those spaces. Size is not the only affordance that matters here with respect to audience. Density matters as well. So thinking about to what extent the members of your audiences are connected to one another, especially on social media. So research shows that denser audiences, those in which people know each other, tend to be more tightly knit. There tend to be closer relationships. They tend to be more supportive. But if you go in spaces like oftentimes Twitter, where you have large audiences who are not so dense, they're not people who belong to the same social circles and know each other, the more heterogeneous audiences tend to be less supportive and put more pressure on self-presenters. Of course, we have anonymity. Again, this is something that we didn't have before communication technologies. We can communicate with other people without revealing any information about our name or anything other that can be used to identify us, like physical appearance or location and so on and so forth. So in situations where we need social support, for example, when we need to talk about topics that are sensitive or stigmatized, anonymity can actually be really helpful. In other situations, like the commenting features of newspapers, it can be really detrimental because it promotes disinhibition. People say and do things that they wouldn't do face-to-face. So these are the features and affordances that I think about a lot, and that a lot of research has shown to be really meaningful in terms of producing well-being effects. Now, in terms of user characteristics, this is a really broad framework for thinking about the users. We have to keep in mind what their goals and what their motivations are, of course. Do they care about what they say and how they come across and how they're being evaluated, and do they not? In certain spaces we do, in other spaces we do not, and that really affects how we engage with the technological affordances that I mentioned earlier. If motivation is low, it might not even matter that you have a large audience because you don't really care how you're being evaluated, so you might be using the technology in less thoughtful ways. Of course, it goes without saying that people's experience and ability to engage with the technology really matters. Age plays a part here. Oftentimes when we deal with older population, the kind of knowledge of various features and affordances that are available to them is much more limited than the digital natives that some of you probably are, that are my students definitely are, who have great expertise and understanding of these affordances. And finally, what's most intriguing to me as a psychologist is to think about the psychological makeup of the users. Things like gender and age that are pretty straightforward to understand. but also the kind of the personality traits that they bring to the table. Are they sociable or not sociable, neurotic or non-neurotic, open to experience or not so much? All of these have been shown repeatedly to affect how people engage with various platforms and the kinds of effects that they derive from those uses. And of course, what's really interesting to me is well-being indicators that are kind of chronic, like social anxiety or shyness or depression or loneliness. Those actually affect how people orient towards communication technologies. The majority of research and the community tends to think about well-being as an outcome of technology use, but recently we're starting to shift the lens into thinking of well-being as a predictor of technology use, right? People with these needs and characteristics related especially to well-being deficits will use technologies in different ways, and it's important to think about that. Okay, so now that I've laid the foundation of issues that we think about here, let's delve into the main topics for today. The first is impression formation. Impression formation is the process of evaluating other people as we meet them. It's very powerful in what we call zero acquaintance context. So when we meet somebody for the first time, we're very motivated to form impressions, and we form them very quickly and unconsciously. And deceptively, right? We feel like we know people based on very little information when in fact, we really don't. Stereotyping is a big part of that, of course. And just the need and the impulse to make sense of other people is very fundamental to how human beings operate. Of course, we form and refine impressions even in more established relationships. As we get more information about people, we either solidify what we already know and think about them, or shift it and change it altogether. Perhaps you've heard about this really famous piece of research that shows the very first impressions that we form about somebody extremely quickly relate to two dimensions, which is warmth and competence. So very quickly we decide if this is a person we trust or don't trust, or like or do not like. That's the warmth component. And then the competence component is, are they capable? Are they intelligent? Can I rely on them or not? Now, let's think about some of the cues that I've outlined earlier and how they may play a part in impression formation processes. And the first that is extremely well researched is the reduction in cues. So on many technological platforms, when we meet people for the first time, we simply do not have as much information about them as we do face to face. We can see them, we can hear them, we can see what they're wearing and how they're carrying themselves and what they look like. Physical appearance is actually extremely meaningful in impression formation. So, but nonetheless, research shows that we form impressions really quickly, even when what we have to go by is just an email, just a piece of text, just a short profile. We still form impressions very quickly and confidently. We feel confident that we know important information about the person we're interacting with. So I'd like to introduce to you now a theory that's very powerful, that I use a lot in my research, that explains the kinds of impressions that we tend to form when we're interacting with others for the first time in reduced cue environments. But also it explains the kind of impressions that we form of even people we already know when we communicate with them in reduced cue environments, as is the case in long distance relationships, but also in relationships where there's just a great deal of mediated communication, usually texting. The theory is called hyperpersonal model. So we're going to talk about hyperpersonal processes, and kind of let me lay it out for you here. The theory is basically saying that technological affordances kind of affect what happens with communicators at every level of the communication process. The first level is the sender. What kind of messages the sender puts together. The second is the receiver, how the receiver interprets those messages. The feedback refers to the communication between the two. So at the sender level, when we have reduced cues, what we typically have is also more ability to control our messages. So I've talked to you earlier about controllable affordances, that typically means that people can put more thoughtfulness and manage their messages more carefully, of course, when they want to. So motivation is a big part here that really matters. So in many situations, we really care about how we're being evaluated by other people, such as when we're constructing a dating profile, or when we're on a job interview, or when we're talking with large audiences of people. All of those factors actually increase our motivation to control our messages. And the technological affordances that I mentioned earlier, especially the reduction in cues, allow us to do that.
Yeah.
So,
hey, Catalina, super
oh,
quick.
yeah.
We have a cool question that I think is really insightful on this.
Excellent.
Webcams, they can show people in a more vulnerable context in their home, with their kids, pets, roommates. This is from, do you have any suggestions or opinions on meeting software that replaces or blurs backgrounds?
Yes. So it depends on what the context is. It always depends. And with the kind of research that I do, the kind of thinking that I do. So yes, you're completely right. It is a more vulnerable space. People might not feel comfortable with this vulnerability, especially a certain kind of person, right? If you have somebody who may be socially anxious, or maybe shy, or just maybe a very private person, they probably do feel enhanced vulnerability. So supporting them through such tools as blurring of backgrounds, or providing new backdrops, could be really helpful. Also, the situation matters. If you're a situation where you feel like you're being evaluated, and you're very highly motivated to control how you come across, this could be helpful as well. As you can tell here, I haven't blurred my background. I have thought about it. But I perceive this as a fun opportunity to talk to y'all. I'm also not a very socially anxious person in this particular context. I chose not to do it. Maybe I'm oversharing. As I was telling Benny earlier, my cat could make an appearance at any moment now. But if I was in a job interview, I would definitely not be showing so much, for sure. So yeah, these tools can be very helpful for some people, especially in certain circumstances. Do we have any follow-ups? Are we okay, Benny?
Right now, yeah. And Ross, let us know if you have any follow-up to that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I see how, yeah, it's like hanging out with your friends, you're there with family. Yeah, show it off. But yeah, I mean, even me, right? And I've like my background's perfectly black. I definitely went that route. So I think that's a really insightful answer.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Okay, so we've talked about the sender dynamics. Let's talk about the receiver dynamics, because these are actually the most interesting, in my opinion. So we have a sender who sometimes presents themselves very carefully and in a very controlled manner when they care to do so. On the receiver end, we have limited information, right? Reduced cues. We just don't know as much as if we had seen people face to face or in richer environments. So what tends to happen here is a cognitive process that's really powerful. It's what we call over-attribution. Over-attribution means like mentally filling in the blanks for unavailable information with information that makes sense to us. We do it all the time. It's actually the basis of stereotyping, because as human beings, we're motivated to know. We don't like the feeling of not knowing what's happening in a certain situation. Uncertainty is a very aversive state that we're trying to kind of unconsciously manage. And one way to unconsciously manage it is over-attribution. So unconsciously filling in the blanks for information that you do have with information that makes sense. So when you have very little information about somebody, and that information is kind of polished and it's something that you like and agree with, you tend to go one step beyond and imagine that you really like the person and they're really great, and your impressions of them are kind of intensified in a positive way compared to what they would have been if you had richer information. So instead of seeing the person kind of fully, you see just a sliver of them, but you think you know more than you actually know. And this works in interesting ways for positive impressions. Consider, for instance, a dating profile where somebody has really put their best face forward. You can become much more interested and much more intrigued and enamored with this person based on their profile than you would have been had you met them face to face. And that's maybe a good thing if you're trying to engage people and get a lot of attention, but down the line might not be the most strategic thing. And a lot of research is documenting this. If the profile is too glamorized and too careful and too well put together, it could lead to kind of a boomerang effect when you finally meet the person face to face, because you will have put them on a pedestal, and then they just can't match up when you see them more fully in person down the line. So you want to be careful about how controlled and glamorized you want to be because of this over-attribution process. But what's really intriguing is that over-attribution can happen in a negative way as well. So if the sender maybe is not really motivated about what they come across and kind of what messages they put forth, or maybe they just put forth messages that the receiver fundamentally disagrees with and opposes, the receiver can also overblow the situation and imagine that the sender is much worse, much more terrible than they would have thought otherwise if they had more information. And we've seen this a lot. If you've been paying attention, I'm sure you have, to the political environment in recent years, where we're seeing increased polarization. And a lot of it is due to the fact that we're seeing snippets of messages that people who disagree with us will post, and we just imagine to be so terrible and so horrible just because that's all we know about them. And the emotionality of the interaction gets way overblown than it would have in information spaces with more cues. So over-attribution is really powerful and something that we want to pay attention to. And of course, that affects the feedback dynamics between the two. If while we know about the person as stuff that we like and we approve of, we treat them well, they respond well, that creates what we call an intensification loop. So people can really like each other a lot when they're communicating in these spaces. If everything goes well. On the negative side, if the impressions that we form initially are kind of negative, we respond in kind. We imagine the person is much worse than we would have thought otherwise. We treat them poorly. They respond poorly. That tends to intensify as well. Maybe you've seen the trend of lots of newspapers closing their comment sections just because they're getting too vitriolic and too contentious, precisely because this intensification loop occurs. So hopefully I've armed you with some theoretical tools here for understanding what is happening both on the positive and the negative end with these types of interactions. So the takeaway for those of you who are designers here is, if intensification of emotions and of liking and relationality is something that you want to encourage in your interaction space, you might consider removing cues. You might consider not going for video conferencing or not even allowing photographs. There's research showing that text-based messages are perceived even more positively than messages that are accompanied by a photograph, for example. But if you want to discourage intensification, if you want to have a space where impressions are more reasonable, more realistic, then you might consider reintroducing cues and making the interaction space a little richer. Do we have any questions or comments here?
I was wondering super quick.
Yeah.
If you could think of any examples of like an environment that would be reduced cues, or maybe on the other side before we move on, because I think that was really insightful what you had to say.
Oh, thank you. So a reduced cue environment would be email, for example, or texting. Or even the phone, although on the phone you have vocal cues. We can even think about ranking these environments in terms of how much information, what kind of bandwidth they have. So, texting or email would be something that's really low in bandwidth. The phone would have maybe a little bit more bandwidth. Video conferencing would have a lot of bandwidth, actually, and face-to-face would have the most bandwidth, because even though video conferencing actually replicates face-to-face in many ways, we're still missing some cues. For instance, we don't have proxemics cues. So this is about physical distance. Lots of interesting research shows that how closely you are physically to somebody can encourage attraction or not. If you're too close, that's a problem. If you're too far away, it's a problem. There's a sweet spot, a Goldilocks that encourages bonding and attraction. We also have haptics, so touch, interpersonal touch. We're not talking about sexual touch here necessarily or at all. But interpersonal touch can also foster liking and attraction and bonding. And we don't have that with video conferencing. So yeah, this is how I would rank them according to how much nonverbal cues they possess. And this matters. I haven't talked about it here, but it matters. Nonverbal cues matter greatly in trust formation, for example. Human beings are still kind of primed to respond really well to nonverbal cues when it comes to trust. And when we take that away, people tend to be less trusting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I can feel it myself too. I think I can sense that in my own experiences. So yeah, and if anybody has any more, obviously continue to let us know in the chat. But yeah, I think that's awesome.
Awesome. So we've talked about a reduction of cue, but there's...
Yeah, and actually, Catalina, there was one that just came in just a second. Question from Holly. She asks, could you expand on the impression formation as it relates to intentional misinformation?
Can Holly give me a little bit more background about what she means here? Is it about deception? I mean, because we can deceive people quite easily online, and deception could be difficult to detect when we have very little information.
Yeah, and I know, Holly, if you're typing out, absolutely, and I'll know. But I think that is kind of what Holly's getting at, is like, as we're in this environment where there are these perhaps nefarious, or maybe even just misguided, but like, how might that, like, do they have, like, how can we be on top of that with this understanding of impressions?
That's right. This is a great question. It's actually kind of a perfect segue into what I was going to talk about next. So let me come back to this question after I review a new theory for us to know about that specifically deals with trust and deception.
Awesome.
And this pertains to impression formation as a function of the source of the cues and the valence of the cues. And I'll come back to these concepts in a little bit. But the theory we're talking about is warranting theory. And warranting theory is basically the idea that if we are interested in forming and gaining trust online and perceiving people as trustworthy and determining whether or not to believe them, which hopefully relates to Holly's question, we will pay attention to what we call warrants online. So warrants are pieces of information that kind of enhance the credibility of information in online spaces, which is a big problem when we are interacting with strangers and we have a reduction of cues, right? We just don't know a lot about them. Think about warrants as anything that is difficult to manipulate. So people are kind of savvy about this. They tend to orient towards information that is more difficult to manipulate online when trying to ascertain somebody's trustworthiness and when being concerned with maybe deception and misinformation. For example, let me give you some example of warrants. Third-party statements, right? They have been shown actually to be a lot more credible than self-statements. Why? Because they're more difficult to manipulate. So by definition, a warrant is something that is harder to manipulate. A second would be anything that connects the online self with the offline self is viewed as more credible. So we're talking here about friend lists or even about photographs or displaying information that allows for the online self to be somehow connected with the offline self. Also, showing rather than telling. Showing is more believable than telling because it's harder to manipulate. So let me give you an example. If I can just make a claim online verbally very, very easily with very little cost to me. So for example, I can say, I play the piano. It doesn't take any effort on my end to just type that out to say it. But if I post a video of myself playing the piano, that tends to be a lot more credible because it takes a lot more effort to demonstrate that skill, and it's also much harder to manipulate. So if you are concerned with trustworthiness or disinformation, think about showing rather than telling, connecting your online self with the offline self, and including third-party statements. So let me give you some examples of takeaways. You can, as a designer, you can think about adding or emphasizing or foregrounding warrants if you wish to enhance credibility of the product or the person that you're trying to promote or the organization that you're trying to promote. So information that's added by others or information that requires others' complicity or agreement, like being friends with somebody on certain platforms like Facebook, where I can't just be friends with somebody by clicking friends by myself. They also have to agree, right? So their complicity is necessary in that situation. So if you're concerned about credibility, think about warrants and add warrants. Another takeaway, especially with social media, is that friend-generated cues, so information that's added by others who we're connected with on those media, are very consequential when people are evaluating us. There's really interesting research showing that when you present people with self-statements and other statements, so statements that I make about myself and statements that others make about me, the statements made by others are more consequential, they're heavier, they play a more powerful role in impression formation. So other people rely on those to a greater degree. Hopefully this addresses Holly's question. So
yeah, and I know Holly did ask, just to add the detail, relating to like COVID, you know, and COVID misinformation about like science and facts versus political, in case you wanted to add something with that.
COVID misinformation. I'm not sure. This is where I wish we could actually talk. so Holly could explain this to me. Of course, so when we're going to evaluate the trustworthiness of this information, which hopefully all of us are concerned with, we want to think about the source. This is not so much about interpersonal impressions, but oftentimes more institutional impressions. What is the source? Where are they coming from? What kind of expertise do they have? And those would be more reliable. There'll be greater warrants than my neighbor said so-and-so, or a friend said so-and-so, because the expertise there is lacking. Okay, let's move on. Let's see, it's 2:40, so we have 20 minutes. Let's move on to another perspective about how people form impressions online, which is the negativity effect, something for all of us to be aware of when we're constructing our presentations, or even when we're evaluating other people's self-presentation. It's a pretty simple and powerful idea here, which is that negative information tends to be as more diagnostic, so it's weighted more heavily in impression formation than positive information. This is always the case. It's the case face-to-face, but it's especially the case in social media platforms, where the majority of people will present themselves positively the majority of the time. So why are we seeing this negativity effect? Because negative information is not normative. It's rare. It doesn't conform to social norms. It's not expected. So when you see it, it grabs you, right? It grabs more attention, and it becomes more powerful in the kinds of impressions that you form about others. And in particular, research is actually showing this kind of additivity effect between warranting and negativity. So this is a powerful combination, especially when you have negative information that is contributed about somebody else, or that is difficult to manipulate. That tends to be really powerful in impression formation. And we've seen this in lots of studies of Facebook profiles, for example, where you say something by yourself and your friends say something about you. If what your friends have to say is negative, that's particularly credible. It's something that I think we all kind of knew intuitively, that we have to manage negative reviews that come from others. And here's the theory as to why that is the case. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions or comments about these ideas related to impression formation. So again, just to summarize, the kinds of environments we interact with shape impressions through the reduction in cues, how little or how much information we have about somebody, the source of the cues, who's telling that information, and the valence of the cues. Valence means is it positive or is it negative? If it's positive, it's kind of expected. It's not so consequential because the majority of people present themselves in positive ways. If it's negative, it tends to be much more consequential, especially if it comes from reliable sources.
Yeah, and I think people are, I don't, if people have questions, please feel free to put them in the room and we'll have a chance to come back later too.
Yeah.
If you have a question now and you forget to type it in. Because really interesting.
Excellent. Well, now we're going to shift gears to the topic of psychological well-being kind of more directly. So I want to talk to you about research on social media and psychological well-being, which hopefully you'll find interesting from a variety of perspectives. This will kind of tell you what kind of activities on social media promote well-being and what kind of activities are detrimental to well-being. This is, of course, good for all of us to know as users. The majority of us are users, but also as designers who may think about highlighting the positive activities and maybe thinking about ways of minimizing the ones that have detrimental effects. Also, because as people in the tech field, you probably get questions all the time from family and friends and community members about what is happening in these spaces. Is social media good or bad for you? That question has been asked for 10 years that I've been around studying it, and it's still going strong. So people want to know if it's good or bad to be on social media. And usually people have pretty strong intuitions about that. Depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to professors like me, many of us have gotten into this field because we're fascinated by the positive potential of social media and we orient towards those things. If you talk to people in the community, especially parents, they tend to be very worried and much more negative about what social media does to our psychological well-being. So perhaps, the first and most obvious question is about the net effect. Is, if we put it all together, is social media good or bad for you? And luckily, there's been a variety of studies on this topic. They're both kind of meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is a study that aggregates across all of the studies done on a specific topic. So it's just a lot more powerful and a lot more definitive than a single study. So there's been a bunch of meta-analyses. There's also been a bunch of longitudinal studies that kind of have tracked people over time to see if in the long term social media use is good or bad for your psychological well-being, controlling for your pre-existing psychological well-being, which is also important to do. So here's the conclusion. The short version of the story is social media tends to have a negative effect, but it is very, very, very small. It is statistically negligible. It's not really different from zero when you put it all together. You might wonder why I have a picture of potatoes here. This is one cool study that maybe you have seen looking at the net effect of social media use on adolescents, which is a vulnerable population, also perhaps some of the heaviest users of social media. Apparently, the effect of social media on adolescents' well-being is the same as the effect of eating potatoes. Almost negligible, almost doesn't matter. The effect of wearing glasses is actually greater on adolescents' well-being than the effects of social media use, which may be counterintuitive to lots of us. Now, this being said, it doesn't mean that social media doesn't have an effect and we shouldn't think about it or shouldn't worry about it. Rather, what this means is that we really need to focus on what people do online, because different activities have vastly different effects that probably will cancel each other out when we look at aggregates, which is what the previous studies have done. Different activities have vastly different psychological effects, so we need to focus on those specific activities, and we need to think granular. We cannot ask the question of, is social media good or bad for you? That is the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of uses on social media are good or bad for you? So I'm going to give you some examples here of the good uses and the good activities and the bad uses and the bad activities that have been researched to date. The good, social capital. You may be aware of this term. It means social capital refers to the resources that we derive by being connected with other people. And there's two types of social capital we can think about. One is bridging social capital. That refers to getting information, getting new perspectives, learning new things, feeling part of the broader community. That's bridging social capital. And it stems from being connected to weak ties, to people we don't necessarily know very well. They're still very beneficial. The other type of social capital is bonding social capital. That refers to the warm and fuzzies, to the emotional support, to feeling really connected and bonded to other people. That's the kind of social capital that stems from close relationships, from strong ties. Well, research is showing that people do derive a lot of social capital from social media use, but it only comes from directed communication. You only derive social capital when you actively write messages to other people, not from lurking and not from just broadcasting. So if you're posting status updates kind of into the ether and other people aren't engaging with them, that won't do very much for your social capital. But if you're directly asking questions, interacting with people, sending messages on social media, that's really meaningful. So research actually shows that we get bridging. We do not get bonding social capital from social media. So we're learning new perspective. We're getting advice. We're learning about the world. And this comes from directed communication, but not from broadcasting or lurking or passive communication. Now, this is particularly exciting because research shows that it's users with low communication skills and low self-esteem that tend to benefit the most in terms of acquiring social capital from social media. So this is kind of a poor get richer perspective. So those people who have low social skills or low self-esteem are the kind of people who don't fare very, very well face-to-face in terms of acquiring social capital. But social media provides an outlet for them to compensate for this, right? It's a poor get richer online because it facilitates the acquisition of social capital in ways that face-to-face does not. So this is really exciting to be thinking about how these particularly vulnerable users might benefit. All right, let's review another good aspect of social media use in terms of well-being. Well, it turns out that crafting self-presentation, so identity constructions, putting together profiles, and then thinking about them, reviewing them, that's self-reflection, feels really good and is really good. And here's why. When we construct profiles of ourselves on social media, think Facebook, think Instagram, these are the platforms that have been the most studied, we tend to highlight the positives. We all know this. The reason we highlight the positives is because we have extraordinarily large audiences who are looking at us and we want to impress and we want to make a good impression. Research actually shows that the larger the audience you have, the more motivated you are to make a good impression. But the audiences are interesting. They're not just complete strangers who will believe anything. They're very heterogeneous audiences. They do include some strangers, but they also include our friends or family members, people who know us offline pretty well. These are people who can verify what we're saying. We can completely fabricate things when we're talking to them. So because of that, we create self-presentations that are both positive and accurate. We present slivers of information, slivers of our lives that are the good parts, the truthfully good things that audiences can see. And it turns out that when we're constructing these positive and accurate versions of ourselves and we're thinking about them, reflecting upon them, we experience self-affirmation. We feel good about ourselves. Our self-esteem increases. Lots of studies are showing this. Have somebody, if you're feeling down, here's a tip. Go review your Instagram profile or your social media or your Facebook profile. That is likely to give you a boost of self-esteem and provide self-affirmation. That is a good outcome of social media use. Another good outcome also stems from directed communication, so from typing out messages, talking to other people in a straightforward way. It's good for friendship maintenance, actually. Lots of people are concerned that social media use will take away from our offline friendships. And mostly, a lot of these concerns are because time isn't elastic, right? The more we talk to people online, the more time we spend online. Seems like the less time we have to dedicate to our friends in face-to-face settings. Well, this is actually not supported by research. Actually, social media communication leads to even more mediated and more face-to-face communication with people. So if we start talking to them online, posting comments, sending messages, that creates more opportunities for interaction and engagement with those people down the line. We tend to transport the conversation to other media like texting or the phone, and to face-to-face spaces give us more to talk about. And that leads to a strengthening of friendship. So there's strong evidence that social media reinforces friendships. Actually, it doesn't displace them. It doesn't take time away from friendships and impoverish them in this way. And let me give you a bit of the bad as well, as I said, because lots of us are intrigued by the potential of social media to improve lives and help people. These well-being effects have been, the good part have been really well studied, but there's also research on the bad activities that happen on social media. Perhaps the best studied is the issue of social comparison. So I've talked earlier about how all of us present a positive sliver of information of ourselves online. I like to call this the glamorized glimpses. We give people a glimpse into our lives, into the good aspects of our lives. And we know that we do that when we do it ourselves, but somehow people do not connect that everybody does the same thing. It's not just me when I construct my profile. It's not just me putting my best face forward. Everybody does the same thing. So research is actually showing that when we're passively browsing through other people's postings and their profiles, we tend to feel bad about ourselves. It correlates with depressiveness. It correlates with envy. And that's because we feel like everybody's lives are better than us. We engage in a detrimental social comparison. So social media really fosters these social comparisons. It gives kind of a skewed perspective of how much better everybody else is doing compared to us. So a lot of lurking, spending a lot of time looking at other people, especially when you're in a vulnerable state, especially when you're already feeling sad, is a bad thing, has been shown to have really negative consequences.
Yeah, and I know, Catalina, there was a quick question
let's
from
hear.
Ross. He says, we watch everyone's highlight reel knowing what's on our cutting room floor. And I was curious, how does that
beautiful way of saying it.
Yeah. Wonderful.
That's exactly, you just captured the theory that I was presenting here. We see everybody's highlight reel. We don't see the fullness of their lives. We don't see the struggles. We don't see the boredom, right? That doesn't make for good social media postings. And we fail to realize that. And the negative effect is particularly powerful in the aggregate. Like, we're seeing everybody else supposedly having such a great time, and we don't realize that, first of all, it's not everybody else, it's just the people who are posting, but it's a lot of them. So it can give us a false impression that there's a lot of happy people out there, right? And we're just seeing the highlight reel, and that is a problem. And becoming aware of it is helpful, especially in taking social media breaks. A lot of research is showing that when people wise up to these dynamics and they know that they themselves are going through a bad time, like maybe you're going through a breakup, or maybe you've been laid off, or maybe you're having issues with family or whatever. If you're feeling down, it's a good idea to not expose yourself to these other people who seem to be doing so much better than you. So that's a good strategy to employ. Cool. I just have a couple more for you. Social media surveillance, that is the act of kind of, we call it stalking or creeping on other people on social media. There's a lot of research that's showing this is problematic. in the way of social comparison, like I've described just now, but also in the very specific context of romantic jealousy. In a relationship context, in a romantic relationship context, this has been shown to be pretty bad in promoting jealousy. And again, because we have reduced cues, we have very little information about what our partner is doing with these other people that we're seeing traces of online. And if we're in a jealous state of mind to begin with, it's easy to mentally fill in the blanks and kind of escalate. And if your partner maybe is just interacting or commenting or giving attention to somebody you perceive as potential romantic competitor, you can exaggerate that in your mind, and it can produce much more jealousy. Relatedly, there's research on whether or not we should stay connected with romantic partners on social media after a breakup. And the answer is no. Research shows that it's better for well-being to sever those connections, because, again, the ex-partner will be posting their highlight reels, so they'll be appearing to be doing much better than they actually are, and that can make you feel worse. Can make you feel left behind, and it just sucks to feel like your partner is doing so great without you, right? It can exacerbate feelings of sadness and depression. It can impede breakup recovery. And finally, I have one more for you, a little unrelated. Multitasking and task switching is also a really detrimental activity on social media. So if we interrupt our primary tasks, our work-related tasks, usually with social media breaks, that tends to decrease performance and actually worsen mood down the line. Oftentimes, we do it as a way to manage negative feelings like the desire to procrastinate, but it's not effective. Research shows that it actually decreases task performance and increases mood at the end of the day. So, last slide to summarize. When it comes to social media and well-being, many benefits actually come from active uses. So when we actually talk to people, send them messages, connect with them directly, have conversations, many benefits accrue. Self-presentations, creating profiles, creating versions of ourselves is also really beneficial for self-esteem. But passive uses can be problematic. Stalking others on social media, comparing ourselves with others on social media, taking social media multitasking breaks, right? Migrating from our primary task to browsing stuff on social media, that tends to be problematic. Okay, so I will stop here. Let me stop sharing, actually. So, no, I think I still won't be able to see any of you, but I get to see Benny, so that's nice. We have do we have any more minutes?
I know the time is up. If people do have final questions, I'm still hanging out. But it is true that our time's over. Catalina, this has been incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been so fun to talk to you. I'm happy to hang out too. I've given you my email address. Please feel free to reach out. I always love to talk to members of the community about this. If you want to have further conversations, I'm available.
Fantastic. So yeah, so everybody, if you do want to have any last questions, we'll give it a second if you're typing anything out, because absolutely, this has just been such an honor. Like, yeah, it was so cool because we were like, we know we wanted somebody to talk about this. You know, we're like, we knew what we wanted to do, and then it was like this light bulb went off in our head that and so I'm just so grateful that you were able to make this time with us. And
likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So cool. So yeah, if anybody does have any questions that they weren't able to get out now, as Catalina said, her email is here in her profile. And you can always reach out to me too, you know, if you need to get in touch, if we click off and we forget that. We are also recording this, so it will be posted within a few days to the Forward Fest app, as well as to the conference website. And on that note, you know, it's been an incredible conference, and this is an incredible way to end it, because it's almost kind of a sad moment to close it down, to say goodbye to everybody. But it's happy because we got so much done over these last few days. We learned so much. We had people join us from all over the world, which was something really special. And it was just such an honor to be able to be here with all of you. So from the bottom of our hearts, you know, at Forward Fest, at Forward Tech Conference, Thank you, Catalina, and all the speakers who have since also gone. And thank you to everybody here, and thank you to the community. And with that, I think I wish you a good night. And as I said, we will still be here for a few minutes. Thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you have an incredible day.